thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that? Yes. Everybody?
Yeah, yep, looks good.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I thought what I would do is kind of go through the, my own process of finding the mother tree in this talk. And weave with it, my background, but also my current, I'll talk about my current research as well. And the Wood Wide Web, yes. Actually, it wasn't Paul Stamets who invented that name. It was actually the journal Nature, because I had published my first work on plant interconnections through mycorrhizal fungi in that journal Nature. And so they came up with that name, which was, it's now become kind of like a meme. It's a great name. I mean, it does sort of think of trees as wood, which is, trees are more than that, but still, it's a nice little moniker that we can easily remember. So where am I? I'm actually way across the continent in a little town called Nelson. And can you see the little arrow here that I've got? Yeah, I'm imagining you can. So I live way over here in British Columbia, and I'm just in this sort of wet forest just west of the Rocky Mountains. And my research that I'm going to tell you about occurred all in this area here, in the Pacific Northwest, but in Canada. And the forests are very much like, if you've been over to Oregon and Washington and Northern California, these forests, these are the Pacific Rim forests. They go all the way from Alaska, all the way down to Southern California and into Mexico. These are what I call Pacific Rim forests. They are some of the most productive forests in the world. You can see here on this map of the Americas, this is actually a carbon density map. And it just shows how these North American forests here along the Pacific are so carbon rich. In fact, the carbon sequestration in forests along the coast here the rates are equivalent to what's going on in the Amazon. These forests, and this forest here I'm going to show you is called Fairy Creek. This forest is right on the West Coast, and scientists have measured its carbon stocks and sequestration rates, and the carbon stocks, which we measure as tons of carbon per hectare, is the same as what's in the Amazon tropical rainforest, in the most productive forests. The difference is that in these forests, that carbon, half of it is stored below ground and half of it is above ground, what we see here in this picture, in this watershed. In the rest of Canada, when people have looked at carbon stocks across Canada, amazingly enough, when you include the peatlands, the prairies, and the forests, 90% or 95% of the carbon in these forests is stored below ground. It's astonishing. When you're in the tropics, it's the other way around. I don't know the exact numbers, but the vast majority of carbon is in the plants and trees above ground because it's cycled tightly in those trees. But of course, in our Northwest forests, the mycelium is a large part of that carbon that's stored below ground. So hugely important. This particular watershed, called Fairy Creek, has been in the news lately. And the reason it's been in the news is because these forests have been under constant pressure by the corporate logging industry, to the point where the valley bottom forests in Canada along the West Coast, these valley bottom forests, we only have 3% left, which is astonishing. It's because they've been logged. And so there is a great fight going on right now in the West to save the last of the old growth forests. Why is that important? Well, this is actually at the headwaters of Fairy Creek, that forest we were just looking at. The trees in here are 2,000 years old. This is a yellow cedar, Alaska yellow cedar, that's 2,000 years old. She has a name. Her name is Titania. And the companies right now they just got an injunction approved against the protesters that are trying to keep the logging company out to save this last intact watershed on southern Vancouver Island. Titania, 2,000 years old, means that not just that she as a creature is ancient, but all of the biodiversity associated with that agedness is huge. In the below ground community, we know that the fungi, for example, the diversity is way higher than, for example, in a 50-year-old forest. We know that the species are different. The whole community is different, and it's to do with the age, the ancientness of the forest. And so when we cut down these trees, we lose that biodiversity. And mirrored above ground is the biodiversity in the crowns of these trees, the lichens, the mosses, all the ancient, the animals and birds that are associated with these ancient forests, the marbled murrelet, the spotted owl, the yellow belly lichen. There are so many species that are dependent on old growth forest. Okay, so that's just a preamble. I'm going to touch back on that story as I go through my talk, as we go along. But let me begin with the quest of the mother tree. So when I was a young person growing up in Canada, I was born in 1960, and at that time, the forests of the West were old growth forests. There were very few, there was very little logging that went on, and the logging that did go on was selective logging. And so when you looked across this landscape as a kid, you didn't see the harvesting, you just saw old forest. And the forest was, it was a pretty dynamic place, but it was in balance. It was in balance with all these creatures that I just described in that old forest. So, in my own neighborhood where I grew up, more in the interior of the province, so not on the West Coast, but more in the wet belt, we call them the wet belt forests, right along the Rocky Mountains where I live now. I still live here. We have these they're old forests. Also, these are 2,000-year-old, can be up to 2,000-year-old Western red cedars. And these forests, of course, are disappearing very quickly, but this is where I grew up. And that's where I got the foundation of my knowledge of forests, my intuition about how forests are these balanced systems. These aren't just about trees, these forests. These are also salmon forests. So that means that, we have this 7 species of salmon along the Pacific coast. They migrate, they spend most of their life out in the ocean, but they migrate upstream to their natal streams to spawn in the fall every 4 years. And these salmon influence the forest in a big way. And so really the salmon are like a vector from the ocean into the forest, where, that vector is the connection between that aquatic ecosystem and this terrestrial ecosystem. And, the decline of salmon has affected the balance between these two incredible ecosystems. There's been a long history of fishing salmon in these forests, for thousands of years by the indigenous people that lived here. This is the Lillooet Nation along the Fraser River, which is one of the major tributaries coming up from Vancouver that goes up into northern British Columbia. And they're fishing for salmon in the fall with these spears. And so you can see the forks of this spear here. And so a man will be out on this plank, and when the salmon come by in spawning season, they basically spear these fish. So they're incredibly skilled. And in one movement, they'll bring like a salmon that maybe is 30 pounds up onto the shore, and the family will be behind and just basically fillet that fish and dry it on the drying racks. And so I worked in this area for a long time, and I got to see this skillful harvest that was kind of a passive harvest. Of course, spears were involved, but it was very much in tune with the fish, the populations of the fish, and they really only took what they needed for their families. And of course, not all of the rivers and streams in British Columbia are fast-moving rivers. Some of them are slow rivers. And so the technologies of fishing by the Aboriginal people changed accordingly. What you're seeing here is actually a weir. And this weir, and I'm going on and on about this because salmon have such a profound impact on our forests. But the weir is also another passive fishing technology where the fish will move, travel upstream, and the nation or the people would only collect or only keep the fish that were the smaller fish, and they would let the big old fecund mothers go upstream to spawn. And this little gate back here is an area where they would count the fish so that they always had an inventory of how, what the populations were like, and they would change the harvest accordingly. But by always focusing on leaving the big fecund mothers to go upstream to spawn, they basically were winnowing the population in a sense. They were enhancing the size of the fish, the fecundity of the fish, so that big mothers would lay big eggs, which produce big fry and ultimately big fish. And the populations, what the fishery scientists think, especially the Aboriginal fishery scientists, say that the populations are actually increasing along the West Coast through these fishing technologies. This is a chief who is actually returning salmon bones on a cedar plank back to the river. So after the harvest and the eating of the fish, they would always return the remains to the water or to the land, maybe to fertilize a salmonberry bush or a huckleberry bush, but there was always a return to the land. And in the water, especially, the bones would return calcium and other micronutrients that were actually helped keep the streams very fertile for the future spawning of future populations of fish. So this is a cycle, right? It's a cycle that is celebrated in the art of the nations of British Columbia. There are about 200 federally recognized nations in British Columbia alone. And overall, there's far more because they were all very much integrated or evolved, I should say co-evolved with the places that they grew up, the places where they lived. And so there's actually many more nations than what is federally recognized because there are many valleys that are unique and distinct. But this is an artist, April White from the Haida Nation. And you can see here, she's in her canoe and she's returning the bones of the salmon back to the waters. So this concept of the cycle of life, that it's all connected together, that the people, the salmon, the forest are all connected together, is reflected in the languages. The languages are developed from the land. This is a word of the Nachanleth language, and I have a hard time saying it, but it's Hishuk Ish Tsawak. And what that means is we are all one together. And this is another word that means the same thing, but it's from a different nation. It's from the Hamalkaman language of the Coast Salish nation, Netsamotst. It also means we are all one together. We are together. And I would venture that this concept, this worldview that we as human beings are one with all of nature, with all of our environment, that we are integrated with all species, runs throughout Indigenous nations all through the world. And there are words in all these languages that express this oneness and our integration with our whole world, that we are part of this. Of course, that is not how Westerners have often viewed themselves, and which has led to all kinds of problems, but maybe we can have a conversation about that later. But this oneness, in my own journey of becoming a forester and seeing the world or the forest as a place of balance, of connection, really was so influential in the work that I conducted. It had an enormous effect on the way I saw the world and the questions that I asked. So I grew up along this river. It's called the Shuswap River. This is a man of the Splatsin Nation, and they're fishing for salmon along the Shuswap River in the early 1900s, and he's got a weir here. In the early 1900s and the late 1800s, when colonization happened, these people were displaced. as were, their resources, they were no longer able to look after their resources as they had done for millennia. And my family was part of that settler community. We came from France originally and moved across Canada as Quebecois and landed in the Shuswap area. And this man here on the right is my grandfather, Henri Simard. And this man on the left is my great uncle, Wilfred Simard. And they have a string of salmon. And this is their homestead. So they were granted, my great-grandfather, so the dad of these two fellows, my great-grandfather was granted 200 acres of land along the river, displacing the Splatsen nation, as were many European families. The Splatsen were all put in a 200 acre reserve, while each family was given 200 acres just for one family. So that is the history, and it's Canada as a whole is trying to wrestle with this history. And I think globally, we're also wrestling with the history of colonization of Indigenous lands and what's happened to them and the consequences for global change. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But here we are. This is my family. This is where I came from. My family were horse loggers. So they settled in this area and they started logging for white pine. There were huge white pines. This is one right here. And later cedar poles. And those cedar poles eventually were used for putting telephone poles across Western Canada. But everything was, so these were old forests. The trees were huge. Everything was slow and small. So in a single week, my grandfather would pick one tree that they would fell with the hand saws. And so it was a very light touch. And my family actually were quite poor, but they made a living from this. And I think in keeping with the nations, really were taking only what they needed only what they could take, really. My grandfather was an inventor and a logger, and he made all of his own tools. He made his own flumes. He made everything. So this is a flume. So they would be logging deep in the forest and then send these big logs down this flume. And at the base of the flume, when the logs are coming down, my dad, and this is my dad right here, and his brother, my uncle Jacques, would stand at the base on the booms, waiting for these big logs to come barreling down the flume. And then their job was to basically entrain the logs into these booms. And then over the course of the winter, they would move these booms to the river mouth, where then in the springtime at breakup, they would send the logs downriver. And it was extremely dangerous. This is my grandfather again, right here on this big log jam in what they called Skookumchuck Narrows. This is my Uncle Wilfred again and my Uncle Odie. And so, a lot of them, all of my relatives, the men, all had missing fingers, some had missing hands, that was extremely dangerous work, but somehow they made a living out of doing this. And it was, as I said before, it was selective logging. It was slow and small. So this is me. I grew up I grew up in that environment. And so I became a forester myself. But I was born in 1960, as I said before, and that was when the beginning of industrial logging was really getting going. And by the time I was 21, I'm 21 in this picture, this is the kind of logging that was going on. Instead of taking out, an odd white pine and an odd cedar here and there and leaving the forest to self-regenerate, it was, basically continuous clear cutting. This is on Vancouver Island in a place called Mears Island, which is near Clyquet Sound. You might have heard of that. Clyquet Sound is along the west coast of Vancouver Island. And it was this kind of logging that really started a lot of protests at the time. And, the protests were against, this, basically the exploding industry. The industry just took off. And so this is actually, the Shuswap River where my grandfather logged, where you saw Grandpa Henry with his brother and my uncle on the log boom, it's full of logs. So it quickly moved from these family operations that were horse logging to mechanized logging in the 1960s and 70s. And before long, our landscape started to look like this. And so now today, whereas I grew up in a province of old growth forests, it is now a province of clear-cut forests. So, eventually I'm going to tell you what mushrooms have got to do with this, but this is a mushrooming problem. And it has enormous repercussions for all of the major socially, ecologically, economically that are, basically all coming home to roost now. And so, this spawned a lot of protests further. This is the Nchonlith Nation, which lived at Mears Island, and they are protesting. They're marching on the provincial capital to protest against the logging. This is in the early 1980s. At the same time, there's all kinds of other protests going on around the world, as we know. And we know today, these protests really matter. And at the time, it was the nations and the environmentalist movement that came together that resulted in the creation of what we now call the Great Bear Rainforest, which is a large part of the west coast of British Columbia that has been basically not completely set aside, but reduced logging and a creation of parks and what are called indigenous protected and conservation areas. So it mattered. These protests really mattered. Today at Fairy Creek that I just talked about, where this logging pressure is continuing on, where I would say that even though we created the Great Bear Rainforest in the 1990s, it shifted the logging to somewhere else. The rate of logging didn't actually stop, it just shifted. It's kind of like leakage, right? When we think of carbon, it's like leakage in logging. And so today that spawned a whole bunch of new protests against this logging. And I'll come back to that again later. So, and now we're down to the last 2%, as I said earlier. These protests they still matter. In fact, maybe they matter even more now. Okay, so I'm going through this sort of cycle of my outline of how I became aware of the loss of our forests and how important this was to me as a researcher and what I eventually asked. So I became so interested. I worked in the forest industry for about 5 years. I worked for government for about 5 years, and I eventually went back to school and I got my master's and then my PhD. And when I went back to do my master's, I wanted to understand, what the heck were we doing to these forests? Like, if we're clear cutting them, do we get the same forest back, or are they different? And, to me, it seemed like we were disconnecting the forest, and I wanted to know, like, how were we disconnecting it? And I was also really worried at the time that we were replacing these incredible ancient forests with these plantations. And make no mistake, this is what they look like. So where, you take an old forest, you replace it with 1 or 2 species, in this case, Douglas fir. And usually, it would be a mixed stand. Where I grew up, there'd be like 15 species growing together, including cedar and hemlock and white pines and larches and Douglas firs, replaced with just Douglas fir. So not just was it the species diversity of the trees reduced, but along with that goes a reduction in the species of everything else that has co-evolved with those trees. The other practice that took place and is still going on to this very day is to the removal of the plant community, because those plants were viewed as competitors with these trees. And the thinking back in the 1990s and 80s was that, that plants, the way that they survive is that they compete for resources, that they're all out for themselves to get as much light and nitrogen and phosphorus and all those nutrients and water that they can get for themselves. And the more they can get for themselves, the less is available to their neighbors. And so they thought, well, we'll get rid of all those other plants. Let's get rid of the neighbors so that all these resources end up in the trees. That was the thinking. It's kind of like a zero-sum game, right? That you have a pie that is the resource pie, and it's only so big. and it's going to be divided up, and let's divide that pie so it goes all to these trees so that we can harvest these trees in the future. That was the thinking. It created forests like this without very much understory, without much diversity at all. And I thought, this doesn't make sense. I grew up, in these forests that were so diverse with these beautiful, lush understories where all these creatures lived. Why are we removing all of this? In my simple little brain, and believe me, I was told I had a simple little brain, it didn't make sense. And so before long, in the early 1990s, we started to see that these plantations weren't doing so well, where they would take a diverse forest. This is a boreal forest, by the way. It's got spruce and subalpine fir and aspen in it, and it's been replaced with a lodgepole pine forest. And so before long, we started seeing the mountain pine beetle starting to spread through these forests. And eventually the mountain pine beetles killed 40 million hectares of forest right across North America. And it still is going on as it munches its way through the boreal forest. And I think that one of the reasons that the loss was so huge is we had started converting these mixed forests to single species forests. Now that's a bigger story than that, but it was a warning sign that these low diversity forests are vulnerable, and that if something comes along that's a species specific pathogen or insect that's going to infest the forest, if it's already weak from climate change, for example, it's really vulnerable. If you've only got one species with a species specific pest, then that tree cover, that foundation of the forest can disappear really quickly. So I thought, and I was especially interested in the pathogens. So the forest I was working in, there were outbreaks of pathogens, especially one called Armillaria ostoyae, which is a common pathogen in forests in North America. And we were seeing it spreading through our plantations, especially the single species Douglas fir plantations and lodgepole pine, really quickly. And so I thought, what's going on in the soil? And that's what got me so interested in, one of the things that got me so interested in soil. I was just fascinated with soil from the very, very beginning, but I started thinking, if you're looking at a soil profile like this and you've got the forest floor, what's going on here? Like, what is out of balance that's creating this sort of great, food source for these pathogens where they're spreading and getting, out of balance? And so I started looking at the diversity and nutrient availability and studying this, and quickly learned, that most of the activity in the soil is in the forest floor or the upper mineral soil. And that, that nutrient capital and that activity is a whole world. And it's a food web, and a food web that includes fungi. It includes bacteria, includes many thousands and thousands of creatures, tardigrades included. And there are millions of organisms, even in a teaspoon of soil. But it's organized, right? It's not just a random assortment of creatures. They're organized in a food web. So just as above ground, there's a food web, there is below ground. And so at the base of the food web, of course, is our photosynthetic trees and plants that are mycorrhizal, that create litter, that are fed upon by fungi and bacteria. And these in turn are fed upon by larger organisms, springtails and nematodes and mites. And in the process of that feeding process along different trophic levels, these organisms spit out nutrients. So nitrogen and magnesium and calcium. And it is that process of eating, that food chain, that cycles nutrients. That's how nutrients are made available in the overall soil pool that trees and plants can take up. So it's a complex place. And what we were doing in our process of creating simplified forests is we're creating simplified root systems and a simplified soil food web and disrupting that whole nutrient cycle. That whole food web was disrupted. And so pathogens could take over portions of the food web and infect the trees. So I became particularly fascinated with the mycorrhizal element of that food web, because that is the mycorrhizas are the things that link the above ground with the below ground community. And so they're what are filtering carbohydrates that are fixed in the huge crowns of these trees into the soil and energizing that whole soil nutrient cycle. And I became particularly interested in Ectomycorrhizas. And I know that, you guys know all about fungi and mycorrhizas, but I'll just, go over very simply that, there are basically, there's a number of groups of mycorrhizas, functional groups, the ectomycorrhizas, which form the mantle on the outside of the root, where they don't actually penetrate into the cortical cells of the root, but they're basically on the outside. And they associate with most of the conifer species and many deciduous species as well. Then there's also another major group called Arbuscular Mycorrhizas. They're, instead of staying on the outside of the root, they actually penetrate into the roots and into the cortical cells, and they create these arbuscules, or little trees, where there's an exchange of nutrients for carbohydrate along this large surface area of the tree. That's one of many endomycorrhizas. There's also the ericoid mycorrhizas. Okay, let me back up. So these arbuscular mycorrhizas are associated with cedars, for example, maples, willows, poplar trees. There's many yew trees. There's many species that form arbuscular mycorrhizas. But the diversity of species in the arbuscular mycorrhizal group is way, way lower than the ectomycorrhizal group, where there are literally tens of thousands of species of ectomycorrhizas. There's only a few hundred species of arbuscular. And then there's another group that are ectomycorrhizas. So they both form a mantle on the outside and penetrate the cortical cells. And those include the ericoid mycorrhizas. So they associate with the Ericaceae family of species. So that includes all the heathers, the huckleberries, in my neck of the woods, salal plants along the West Coast. So they're a very specialized group. And then the orchid mycorrhizas, another type that's an ectendo, where they form these little coils, or these little funny looking hyphae that are inside the cells. And then there's a third group called arbutoid mycorrhizas, and maybe there's even more, but those are the main ones that I know about anyway. So I mostly study ectomycorrhizas and a little bit about arbuscular mycorrhizas. And you guys all know this. There's so many different, when we're walking in the forest, what we see mostly are the ectomycorrhizas, the fruiting bodies of them, the amanitas, chanterelles, the false chanterelles, the clavulas, truffles. This is the honey mushroom, the armillaria mushroom. So many different species, which of course we know is what makes it so fascinating. And then when you look under the microscope, they're also fascinating. They look amazing. So, these are just the root tips of different species of these ectomycorrhizal fungi that form different kinds of structures, colors, different kinds of strands. And this is just a cross-section of a root. So, people have studied, of course, the hosts and the fidelity of fungi to different hosts. And a group of scientists in Oregon that I ended up studying with for my PhD, Randy Molina and others, started, putting these mycorrhizas into different kinds of host groups. And Randy identified, species that had narrow host ranges. So, for example, Rhizopogon vinicolor, which I've studied quite a bit, associates only with Douglas fir. So it's got a very, very narrow host range. There are intermediate host ranges where, for example, Rhizopogon truncatus will associate with Douglas fir and hemlock, or broad host ranges where, for example, Amanita will associate with many, many species of hosts. And this ability to associate with a wide diversity of hosts means that a single mycorrhizal fungus could actually potentially connect those different hosts together. Or even in a narrow host range, they could also connect hosts of that single species, for example, Douglas fir, together. And so that's what I started studying is these connections. And I was really, of course, when I first started out, I was really interested in how we were disrupting these connections. But before, and what the consequences were for the forest. But first I had to understand the connections themselves. And that's a long story, but I'm gonna skip over time to work that you've probably all heard about. This is the original work on mycorrhizal connections by David Reed, where he was looking at a single species pine seedlings grown in a root box in the laboratory, where he had inoculated them with one fungus. I think this is Apicilithus. and it colonized the roots and connected them together. And it used radioactive carbon on one of the hosts and was able to trace its movement from one host through the mycorrhizal network into the next host. And that was the beginning of our understanding of mycorrhizal networks. That was in the early 1980s. That was done in the lab. And I always wondered, could this happen in forests? And I went on to look in forests through my PhD and found they do exist in forests as well. But I, again, was not the first one to know this. David Reed wasn't the first one either. In fact, it was known by the Aboriginal people along the west coast of the United States that they already knew. The Coast Salish people already knew this. And there was the Snohomish man, Subier, or Bruce Miller, who talked about it. And there, you can find videos of him talking about this and writing about it, about the fungi that connect the forest, that keeps the forest strong, and how that story of fungi and trees, which they called the tree people because they were connected, they were their kin. The fungi and the trees and the people were all in kin relationships. The story of these networks were important for teaching about alliances and communal strength and diversity and how the community is stronger together. So I credit our Aboriginal people with understanding this first and foremost. Okay, so these networks, though, as we've learned, the more we look, the more we understand how complex they are. And scientists in the Western world have delved into this. And I'm just like, this is research from 20 or 30 years ago, where people started recognizing that, these different species of ectomycorrhizas, these connections, they weren't all the same, that some species had hyphae that came off them. You can't even see them. They called them contact hyphae. Others where there were hyphae coming off that were off the roots that were, only went a short distance. Others that had thicker strands that went medium distances. Others they called long distance explorers, and associated functionality with these different morphotypes. So that the idea being that, that these fine short distance and medium distance hyphae could connect things over, very short distances, whereas these longer distance ones with rhizomorphs and strands could explore over long distances, finding nutrient patches where they could bring nutrients and water back to their hosts over very long distances. And so our understanding of networks really grew to understand that it was really a complex network with all kinds of species involved that had different roles. So at the beginning, we talked about how this has been quite controversial. And after I did my PhD understanding, where I understood and the Wood Wide Web was understood and became a meme, there was still a lot of resistance. And at the beginning, John mentioned that, that the mycologists even didn't really believe it. And I think it's because very much, my work was very much focused on the forest. I was a forester. I wasn't a mycologist, and I'm still not a mycologist. I'm still a forester. But the mycologists said, this is way too plant focused, and there's no indication that that these networks do anything. And we need to know whether or not there are any plants benefiting from this network, or what's moving through them, or is stuff moving through back and forth, or is it all balanced out so it doesn't make any difference? And there was a huge amount of pressure, backlash from the mycology community and the plant community, but especially the mycology community, that really thought this really doesn't matter. It's incredible, really. And so we spent about 20 years sort of spinning our wheels, trying with this kind of, well, it doesn't matter, it does matter. And every study seemed like it had to go back and prove the very existence of the mycorrhizas and then what the effect was on the plant community. And I got to the point where I was ready to ditch the whole thing. And finally, we made a breakthrough. So I had a graduate student who we decided to make a map of what that network looked like in the forest. And we went into a forest, a Douglas fir forest, the one I just showed you previously, that had different ages of trees. And I specifically chose that forest because it was a dynamic forest where you have young trees growing up under the understory of old trees. And the student, Kevin Byler, spent 5 years making this map. And this map is represented, where the circles are represented by the trees, where these great big circles are 250-year-old trees that are quite large. They're about 1 meter in diameter. And then these smaller circles are smaller and younger trees, all the way down to seedlings or saplings that are about 10 years old. And so what you quickly see is this is what we call an uneven age forest, where young seedlings are growing up underneath their parents, basically. The parents shed seeds that fall to the ground, and then the seedlings germinate and grow up under the shade of their parents, and then they eventually become the parents. And what we did is we took this forest that was 30 meters by 30 meters. Sorry, am I taking too long? No. Okay. No. Okay. Sorry.
You're good.
And we did something called short sequence DNA mycorrhiza on it. That's of a certain, this was all right of that mycorrhiza. And this tree has that genet on it as well, that these two trees were therefore connected together. And so Kevin spent 5 years constructing this map of every genet in this forest, and was able to determine that every single tree was linked together by Rhizopogon vinicolor alone. And that the biggest trees were the most highly connected. So these big old trees had got, you know, more connections than these little trees. And even one of these trees, this tree in particular, was connected to 80% of the other trees in this forest. And ultimately that every tree was connected to every other tree, even if it had intermediaries between it. So this tree was actually connected to this tree via, you know, all of these intermediate connections. That was really cool. But the dynamics of the forest came from the interpretation of that network. So these young seedlings were also connected. So when the seeds fell on the forest floor and germinated, those little cotyledons would become colonized. Through our research, we figured out it took about a month, and they became colonized by the existing network, and they linked into that network, and they started feeding from the network. Resources, water experiments on, we found that carbon-13 and N15 and phosphorus could move from these old trees right into the little seedlings. And so then we knew that not only was the network supporting them, but the old trees were subsidizing these little seedlings and giving them a head start. And really, you know, we also discovered that it was a back and forth thing, that these seedlings would also send back a little bit of resource to the old trees themselves. And so now we understood the forest as a connected place that was also a dynamic place. Okay, so these old trees, we started calling them mother trees because they seemed to be mothering the seedlings in the understory. And we went on, we kept asking more questions. And one of my students, Amanda Ace, and then my postdoc, Brian Pickles, and another PhD student, Mana Gorzalach, all got together, and we started asking, can they recognize or can they send more nutrients to their own seedlings versus stranger seedlings? And we found out that, in fact, that they do. And Amanda, in her work, was able to figure out that there's a process called kin selection going on in forests, where these old trees, through their connections through the mycorrhizal networks, were able to favor or provide favors, if you will, to their understory, their own kin, and give them an increased chance of survival. Okay, so now, you know, in my spiral of awareness here, I understood the forest as a connected place. And, you know, and understood that these old trees in particular, the trees that actually the foresters were heavily going after, selectively trying to harvest those things first and foremost, were the linchpins of the forest. They were what connected the forest together. These mother trees were so important. And that, of course, built on other people's work at the same time about how important these old trees were for birds as well, and lichens and all kinds of creatures, but also the mycorrhizal community and the networks. And, you know, getting back to the people, you know, this idea of elders, and I just want to, come home to this, elders in our communities are just as important. And we're not just talking about people being old, we're talking about the role that they play in the community, the role of spreading resources, wisdom, intelligence. The trees are doing the same thing. And this idea of elders has been long recognized in the importance of elders in our Aboriginal communities. And I come back to that because my postdoc at the time, and now she's a professor at UBC, Dr. Teresa Ryan, is also a cedar basket weaver. And we were one day out in the woods walking and talking and looking for cedar trees. And she says, oh, there's one. We'll go to where that big leaf maple is. That's a cedar tree. That's a culturally modified tree. We can harvest bark from that tree. And she said the reason that they look for cedar associated with maples is because they love that those wet microsites. But it turns out that these maples and cedars are also connected by Arbuscular Mycorrhizas, that they're in this community, and that these elder trees, these elder cedars really depend on these maples for transmission of carbon to them in the springtime, in the summertime when they're fully leafed out and they're fixing a lot of carbon. And that, that the cedars will actually send carbon back in the other direction in the shoulder seedling seasons in the spring and the fall, when the maples have dropped their leaves or they're just budding out. And there's a sort of like this sort of sync transition going on in the forest where there's a lot of back and forth going on. So these trees really are in community. They're linked together by arbuscular mycorrhizas, and they're sharing stuff back and forth all the time. And that's what gives them their great productivity. Okay, so now we understand the forest has mother trees, the elders are important, and there's this reciprocal exchange going on, this reciprocity. And that reciprocity isn't just in transmission of carbon between living trees, but we've also have done experiments where and we're continuing on with this work. I have a new student who's going to do some more work on this, where trees that are dying, these old trees as they pass on, that they send even more carbon through these networks to their offspring. And so this reciprocity is not just happens within a cohort, within a generation, but from old or from dead or from dying to the young, to this transgenerational reciprocity. Even seedlings that are growing on old nurse logs, we've done experiments where we show the old trees are transmitting carbon into these young seedlings, even mycorrhizas linking them through these old trees that are laying on the ground. So reciprocity is important, not just in a single moment in time, but through generations as well. And this idea of kinship, is also important, where, just going back to this picture where, here's Douglas fir growing up underneath the shadow of their elder trees. When you're walking in a forest like this, you're surrounded by kinship within a species, but, as it turns out, between species as well. So I'm going to come back to the salmon story, and, this kinship extends to people. And I'm going to, talk a little bit about this. So back along the West Coast, and I talked a lot about the salmon fishery at the beginning, about how it was a passive harvest attuned to the population fluctuations of the salmon, that the people were dependent on salmon. The Haida, the Tsimshian, the Halsik, the Haisla, they call themselves the people of the salmon and the people of the cedar because they're interdependent with them. And one of the ways along the West Coast that they fished is they use what's called ancient tidal stone traps. And those nations that I just mentioned would build these walls underneath the tide, where when the tides came in, and then the tide receded back out, it ebbed back out, there were fish entrained and trapped behind these walls. And what they did is they would, in the fall especially, they would keep the small fish. Some would escape back out to the ocean, but the large fish they always let go upstream to spawn in their natal streams. So this was really important. And in those natal streams, when the fish died and started, after they'd laid their eggs, the bears and the wolves and the eagles would come in and they would feed on those fish. and actually carry them right into the forest. So they would take them into the forest, 30 meters, 60 meters, quite far, and they would find their favorite place between a big old tree and eat the fish. And they would eat, especially the certain parts of the fish, and then a lot of the body of the fish was left there to decay. And so when you go into these forests, these salmon forests, you can see all kinds of bones in the fall, right? It's just littered with bones because the bears have eaten them there, they've decayed. And what does that decayed flesh do? It seeps into the forest floor, and it decomposes and breaks apart into proteins and amino acids, and those amino acids and proteins and nutrients are taken up by the mycorrhizas and delivered straight into the trees. And so scientists have found salmon nitrogen directly in the rings of those trees. I just had a graduate student who defended his thesis last week, and we looked at the effect of salmon on the soil mycorrhizal community and the microbial community. And we found out that the microbial and mycorrhizal community are very much affected by the presence of salmon. We also discovered that the carbon stocks in salmon forests are the most of any forest that we've ever looked at. There is so much carbon in these forests because the trees are so productive. It's really is off the charts of any other upland forest. Okay, so coming back to these old trees then, these are salmon trees. This is in Fairy Creek. This is that Titania, who is 2,000 years old. That's a salmon forest, a salmon tree. And inside a lot of these trees, we find bear dens. In fact, here's me inside of a bear den, right in that forest. And there is about 5 of us people in this den. And this den, like this is a living tree. The bears come back to them every year and eat, and they den, they have their cubs all in the same watersheds. And then of course they do migrate around to adjacent watersheds, but they're extremely important to the cycle of the bears as well. Okay, so I think that what the First Nations were doing with their ancient tidal stone traps is they were carrying out their responsibility to make sure those salmon populations were always strong, never taking more than they needed, always sending the big mothers back upstream, feeding the bear populations and the trees, and making sure that the forest was healthy and strong as well. So, we start to see now that the forest is this system, and scientists nowadays call them complex adaptives, all these parts that work together, and out of these interactions, these relationships emerges what we call complex adaptive behaviors. And those behaviors are things that we see at larger scales. So for example, productivity is a complex adaptive behavior that arises from all those interactions at smaller scales. Or even just, the carbon cycle, for example, is a complex adaptive behavior. The resilience of the forest to disturbance is another behavior, a higher level behavior. And so these connections between trees, it turns out, are extremely important. And the important, and they change by traveling through them. How much all depends on the whole interaction with the entire community. So it's a complex system. So I'm gonna now come back to us as people. How do we fit these systems? And I think I've tried to demonstrate it's also up to us then to come back and be part of the system and have a positive impact. And yeah, we're still doing this. Yeah. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
this is John Harper.
Hi.
We seem to be having an audio issue.
Oh, okay.
Your band, we get a little message that your bandwidth is low. Possibly it might, perhaps if you turn off your video, that would solve your problem and people can still hear you and see your pictures.
Okay, I've only got a few slides to go. let's see, I'm not sure how I can do that.
Down in the bottom left.
Video, that should work.
And there's a little picture of a camera in the bottom left of your screen. Most of this has been great, but there have been just a couple glitchy moments. So and this last one was a little longer than the others. Yeah, there you go. I'll see if that helps. And if people watching could turn off your videos as well, that might just reduce the bandwidth of the entire stream. We've got a lot of people on tonight. I don't think I stopped my video, did I? You did. Yep. Or at least we don't see you right now. And you sound great. So let's keep going. Okay, I'm almost done. So hang in there. So here's a tree that's at Fairy Creek again. This is called a grandfather tree, known as a grandfather tree. So the Nachanlith Nation called them grandfather. A lot of the nations call them grandfather or grandmother or mother or father trees. And you know, unfortunately, we're still cutting these big old trees down, and that's why these protests are happening. So I'm just going to sort of end with that and say, you know, here we are at Fairy Creek. Titania is in here. Titania is still standing. But this is the most diverse carbon-rich forest in the world, next, you know, as much as the Amazon rainforest, you know, half of it below ground, half above ground, 1,300 kilograms or 1,300 tons of carbon per hectare. It's huge. And so people are continuing to protest, and it's violent. And there's a lot at stake here. You know, cutting these forests down is actually accelerating climate change. We know that in British Columbia, for example, that all the forestry activities together emit 4 times as much carbon dioxide than fossil fuels do. So it's not trivial. And I think that these protesters have an important role to play in catching the attention of humanity, that we really need to take a hard look at what we're doing if we really want to abate climate change. So what is resilience? Resilience is knowing all these things, you know, having balance and oneness and awareness and connection and respect and reciprocity, understanding kinship and responsibility to look after our forests as complex systems. And so with that, I think I'll just stop, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. You haven't been able to see the chat, obviously, as you've been presenting, but everyone is just really in a place of gratitude for the work that you're doing, and in awe of these incredible connections and interconnectivity that you've demonstrated in your presentation, but also harrowing to see what's been done. And we have some big picture forest questions and some more micro questions. So maybe I'll start with some of the big picture questions. And I think a lot of people are moved and want to know how they can make a difference. And one person kind of wanted, if you could give a couple of action items, you know, supporting the protesters, or I know there's work on all different levels, but maybe if you have a few suggestions, that would be great.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is very political what's going on, and there's an economically driven, obviously, to cut down these ancient forests, and you know, the forces to cut them down are big and strong and dark. And it's not just the West Coast forests, it's the Amazon forests, you know, the oil and gas exploration, the mining. And so what can you do? You can find those you know, non-governmental organizations that are fighting that. So for example, in
in British Columbia, we've got all kinds of environmental groups. There's the Ancient Forest Alliance, there's the Sierra Club. You can donate to those kinds of organizations. In the Amazon, there is the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance. You can donate to those. You can write to your politicians and your elected officials who then can weigh in on this. For example, in my own constituency, I have gone and visited my member of the Legislative Assembly, and I've said, you know, we need to stop cutting these trees down. Now I have an appointment with the chief forester in the area, and I'm going to, you know, say you need to stop doing this in these areas. You know, a lot of times you need a lot of people on hand, and the movement takes a long time, but it's really important that we continue on with these movements because they do matter. That is what causes change. And we are at a point in climate change where we only have, you know, the IPCC is saying we've only got so many years before we can effectively act to reduce, you know, suffering in the future. We need to take that seriously. Now is the time for that kind of action. So, you know, if you've got, you know, extra energy or even extra money to donate, I would say do it. Yeah, so that's what I would do.
Okay, I'm going to go through a few of these questions that speak a little more to the interactions with the fungus and the plant and tree life. One question was, is there a connection between the root grafts and the mycorrhizae? Can they happen together or separately?
Yeah, all that stuff can go on at the same time, right? Like in Douglas, there's certain species that can graft really easily and others that don't. Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, a lot of the pines will root graft. And then they'll also be connected by their mycorrhizal networks. So all at once, all together. There was a study done in Northern Alberta where they were looking at lodgepole pine and actually excavated this entire root system in a hectare and counted all the root grafts, and they found that 50% of the trees were grafted together, and that there was a transmission of carbohydrate from the bigger trees to the smaller trees that was creating a more even forest. It was actually supporting the younger, smaller trees. And so the same concept happens in mycorrhizal networks as well. So yeah, all of it happens all at once. And I think that the message is these trees, these plants are in community, they grow together, they're interdependent. There is competition for sure, but there's all this collaboration going on that we didn't really recognize until the last couple of decades.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get through as many of these as possible, considering we have a lot of interest here. Do the trees keep passing through carbon through the networks beyond death if they are still standing with the large trunks and roots planted?
You know, it takes it. So dying is a process, just like in people. You know, usually it's not all of a sudden, or it can be, but in trees, you know, often it's a process, and it can take years. And you know, in that process, the mycorrhizal networks change. The amount of carbohydrate and carbon and nitrogen moving through the network changes. What we found was that, you know, when there is a kind of like a sudden herbivory or a sudden injury to a tree, that they would dump a whole bunch of carbon into the network, into their neighboring plants. But certainly the community of fungi changed and the amounts changed over time, but that transmission was really, really rapid. It started as soon as we labeled the trees that were dying, they were immediately shoveling it off into their neighbors. I can't remember what the point of the question was. Can you guide me along a little bit more again?
I think you pretty much covered it. We have so many others. I'd love to move on and get as many answered as possible.
Okay.
Let's see. Someone wonders if you're in favor of efforts to reintroduce genetically modified trees such as American chestnut for blight resistance.
Yeah, you know, I guess I haven't come down on. I feel like my opinion's not as informed as it could be, but you know, I think it's okay. I think we need to be extremely careful not to make sure that these genetic strains are not diminishing other populations, or that the genetic diversity within those genes, the gene diversity within those chromosomes and genes is diverse. But from an ecology point of view, ecosystems are driven by energy, and energy comes from photosynthesis, and you need photosynthesis. And so if the chestnuts were a foundation to those forests, right? They were the major mother trees in the forest at one time. And I think that reintroducing them back in so that they're resistant to the pathogen, from that point of view, is a good thing, right? They drive the energy cycle of the forest. And I think that the way the sort of like the genetic engineering has been done with the chestnut has been very carefully done. And I think I'm coming down on that. It's not a bad thing, but we do need precautions. And that goes for whether you're a tree or a fungus or any organisms. But trees, it's probably, because they have such long life cycles, that they're probably the safest organisms to be modifying compared to, say, a fungus that can reproduce really quickly and then cause a lot of damage. So that was an opinion. So
Sure. There were a couple of questions kind of about with tropical forests. One was wondering, since carbon in tropical forests is concentrated on trees above ground, does it follow that the mycorrhizal activities are not as extensive as in temperate forests?
Yeah, so I haven't studied mycorrhizas in tropical forests, but lots of people have. And mycorrhizas are ubiquitous in those forests as well. Most of the tropical species that form arbuscular mycorrhizas. So unlike our northern temperate forests, where it's mostly ectomycorrhizal groups, the arbuscular mycorrhizas, though, are extremely important in the establishment of those trees. And because they're such generalist fungi, there's only a few hundred species worldwide, that they link those trees together. And people have studied this and found that they're important in regeneration. Even the ectomycorrhizal trees those networks are important when you have an ectomycorrhizal community. So the networks are just as important, but the species identity is different. And so probably some of the functioning would be different, and also I guess another point is those tropical soils are phosphorus depleted, whereas our northern soils are not. And so those mycorrhizas are extremely important at getting at whatever phosphorus they can access, and the arbusculars are especially good at that.
We've got a few questions sort of about the spread of mycelium and stressors and how that sort of interacts. One being just sort of, how does the mycelium create these large networks? Another being, does stress cause the fungus to spread and multiply?
Okay. So two questions. So the mycelium, so there's different ways that mycorrhizas reproduce. So spores, obviously, but ectomycorrhizas in particular, they colonize mainly through hyphal contact. So when a root of a seedling or another tree encounters a network, it will become colonized quite quickly. That's the most common way that the mycelium spreads, is from root to root, just through this vegetative reproduction. Spores are important in increasing the genetic diversity of that mycelial network, but it's not the most common way that actually things become colonized. The second part of the question was, what was the second part of the question again? It was
about stress.
Right.
How that affects the growth
of the mycelium. So that's a good question. So when a tree is under stress, its photosynthetic capacity goes down generally, and it starts to allocate resources to where it needs them the most. So it has all these priority effects. So the first priority will go to reproduction. So you'll see a tree under stress produce a clone crop, for example. They're called stress crops. And a second priority is in the root tips, so they're able to get enough resources to bring up to the plant. And so you probably will get a flush of mycelial growth when the tree is under stress that will access nutrients to try to support that tree. If the tree continues to undergo stress and starts to die and its photosynthetic capacity goes way down, it will start to shed those mycorrhizas. So, I haven't studied this myself, but I it makes sense that it would be a very dynamic system depending on the stress level and the mortality pattern that ensues from that. But it would certainly affect the mycelium.
And someone wanted to know how long the distance is when you're talking about the exchange of nutrients to the host. Like, how long
how far do they go?
How far could that possibly go?
Yeah, so we've done different studies on this. So we've not always using isotopes, but planting trees at different distances from host trees. So seedlings from different host trees. And we found that, the greatest activity and connection and transmission happened within about 5 meters of the tree. That's in our forest. And then of course, so it sort of, follows this exponential decay curve as to, the effect as you move away from the tree. By the time you're out, 50 or the height of the tree, I think a good way to think about it is the height of the tree. The influence of the root zone and the mycorrhizal network is about the same as the height of a tree. And then of course, the neighboring trees they're like the little islands in between, and they'll continue that, they'll sort of reinvigorate that transmission from them as well. So really, think of the forest as this very dynamic internet, right? Where you've got messages going from node to node to node, just like, you tell somebody something and they tell somebody, and it's like how gossip spreads. It's the same thing in a network like this. So it's quite far, but an individual tree, it's mostly within 5 meters, definitely diminishing a lot by 15 meters, and then not much beyond the height of the tree itself.
Someone wanted to know about the fungal interactions with herbaceous plants, the understory herbs, grasses, crops, etc., and their importance for ecosystem functions. Yeah,
super important. And, most of those understory plants, at least in the West Coast, are arbuscular mycorrhizas, mycorrhizal plants. So the herbaceous plants, they form specific groups, and they form their own networks with these arbuscular plants, and they'll form networks with the trees as well if they're arbuscular mycorrhizal. So from a network point of view, they're really important, nodes in the network. And of course, in a broader ecosystem extent, if they play other roles as well. They provide habitat. We've looked at it at Understory from a carbon point of view as well. It's kind of interesting when you're in your forest that the understory plants, which is what we often see as we're walking in the forest, from a carbon perspective, they don't actually contain that much carbon, but their functional role is outsized compared to the amount of carbon that they hold or the amount of biomass that's in them. It's a huge topic.
And it's also interconnected. Okay, so we've got a lot more questions. I just want to check in with Elizabeth, whether we should wrap up or we can kind of go a little over to kind of address a few more.
I think it's really up to Suzanne.
Okay.
I have to leave by about 10 after because I'm going out to meet a friend, but I'm happy to stay until 10 after.
Thank you so much. This is such a treat for us. I know we've all, seen your TED Talks and fantastic fungi, but to be able to ask questions is
yeah, no, it's great. It's great for me too. I love the questions.
Well, this is one from Elizabeth. How does a co-evolved forest fungal, does each species of fungus have a separate mycelial network, or do the hyphae of different fungal species interact and pass along nutrients?
Yeah, not in the ectomycorrhizal community. In the arbuscular mycorrhiza, they talk about anastomosis of hyphae, but usually that would be within a species. So anastomosis is where you have, two hyphae that grow together and then they join, and then they can even share, arbuscular mycorrhizas, they can even have nuclei that move you know, from one hyphae into another. So there can be that, but in Ectomycorrhizas, I haven't heard that that they can form grafts like that. So yeah, it's limited to mostly the arbuscular mycorrhizas.
A couple of questions about research and what you see as the biggest research need, and kind of what keeps you up at night.
You know, I have two daughters. They're in their early 20s, and I worry about the future of mankind and you know, what they're going to have to go through in the, you know, after I'm gone, and all the next generations. So you know, and in British Columbia right now, we're living in climate change. We've had like a really tough year last year where, you know, the fires are incredible, and that's followed by floods. And you know, in my little town of Nelson, there were 4 weeks about where you couldn't breathe. I mean, you could breathe, but you're breathing in, they say it was like breathing in 65 cigarettes a day. And so I'm worried about that. And so you know, what I do with my work, I try to devote the energy I have to trying to solve that problem. And so I'm working on right now, being more of an activist, and less of, I'm still doing research. I still have students, but I'm putting way more time into activism, where I'm trying to, you know, have decisions made where we're, instead of cutting down our forests, we're actually saving our forests, and especially with, you know, with indigenous protected areas. So because a lot of the big carbon stocks and biodiversity worldwide map directly on indigenous lands. And so there is something there that to work with. And so, yeah, so that's what I'm working on. I'm trying to keep our trees standing, because, you know, once the trees are cut, you know, in this era of climate change, they're gone. It's irreplaceable. You were never going to get those back. There's going to be other species moving in. They're not going to live as long. We're not going to get old growth forests back. And all the species associated with them, the fungi, the lichens, they're going to disappear along with those old trees and those old ecosystems. So I think it's the most important thing I can do right now is to put my energy and my influence in that area.
I'm going to ask this question because there's a couple people upvoting it, wanting to know, and this is something I'm not familiar with, the invasion Asian worms are affecting the mycorrhizal network and the communication link between trees.
Actually, I don't know much about the earthworms, but I know that like earthworms are not native to our forests, and they are spreading across Canada and I guess the US as well. And they do change the whole soil profile. So, you know, they burrow down deep and they cycle the forest floor. And so the forest floor, which, remember in that photo I showed, it's very structured. There's the LFH layer, the A, the B, and so on. And the earthworms churn that, and they bring up phosphorus. And in that, and their earthworm casts also bring up, you know, they spread the phosphorus around, and that changes the plant community. And when the plant community changes, the mycorrhizal community changes as well. So earthworms are having a huge impact on the composition of the forests in Canada, and I would expect it's true in the US as well.
How about a kind of practical question about if citizens were to try to inoculate the soil in stress forests after fires or overzealous thinning treatments, and they're referring to dry northern Arizona, where I guess they're located. Do you have suggestions on how to best cover large landscapes and any ticklish issues? I'm not sure what they mean by that. And they say they suspect that using samples from healthier parts of the forest is necessary rather than cultivated sources.
I think you're talking about inoculum, right? Mycorrhizal inoculum. So, you know, yeah, so I've worked quite a bit with in really degraded land, mine spoils, you know, agricultural fields where we've trying to reestablish forests that were once there, and moving soil from a healthy forest into your planting hole makes a huge difference. You know, the mycorrhizas are, you know, as diverse and healthy as they are in the intact forest on those seedlings. And as they grow older, as they are able to establish, they don't die, and then they can actually start putting on leaf area. So soil transplants are really good. I wouldn't transplant it from large distances because you can introduce a host of other problems, but certainly like within your local area, you could move soil. If you can't do that, then commercial inoculums are good in that, you know, that you, if you, and usually there's only one species in a commercial inoculum, but make sure like if it's ectomycorrhizal tree you're trying to establish or shrubs, that it's an ectomycorrhizal fungus that's in your inoculum. And a lot of those inoculums have arbuscular mycorrhizas in them. And so they're not going to do any good for your trees. So check. And what researchers have found is when you introduce those inoculums, it's one species out of hundreds that are in a normal forest, right? It's only one out of hundreds. And what will happen is that the native inoculum, once those trees are able to put on leaf area and start shoveling carbon below ground, they'll start getting colonized by spores or, you know, the native inoculum in the nearby forest, and the introduced inoculum will get replaced. And that's a good thing by the native species. But the reason the inoculum, artificial inoculum, can be important in the beginning is that it can actually help your tree get established, even if it gets replaced by the native species within a year. It helps them get established so that they can connect to the soil. So it's definitely worth it if you are in difficult areas, especially if it's like an area that where the trees have just been cut down, or there's been green, you know, plants that are native plants in the area already. The soil will be full of inoculum anyway, and you won't need to do that. I'm just talking about really, you know, really stressed areas that have been degraded.
Someone was asking about reforestation efforts, just what advice you might have for people advocating for these reforestation efforts and kind of how to do it in an effective way.
So there's, so there's
a big question, I know.
Yeah, there's huge programs that are being started. I'm not sure if this is what this person's talking about, but, you know, to plant 1 trillion trees around the world. There's the LEAF program, which, you know, big companies like Amazon are investing in to plant a lot of trees. Amazon, the company, I mean. And, you know, that's all important. It has to be done right. So, you know, the ecology of the site and matching species and genotypes, you know, things are all co-evolved, right? Fungi and plants have co-evolved in local areas over thousands of years. And so it's really important that these planting efforts are done with knowledge of the local area and with local species and local genotypes. And I worry that these huge programs like the Trillion Trees or the LEAF program, if they don't pay attention to that, it's going to be a lot of money spent with a lot of tree mortality. So it's got to have science, right? And natural history and people on the ground. That's where people are so important, right? Especially as climate's changing. We're the ones that we're looking on the ground. You know, we need local people doing this stuff and making those decisions, not some big corporate entity somewhere. So, and the other thing I would say is that, you know, you can plant 1 trillion trees, but if you're cutting down old growth forests, it doesn't matter. We're not going to plant our way out of this problem. You know, it takes hundreds of years to recapture the carbon that's been stored in an old forest. And we don't have 100 years. So if you're going to put your effort somewhere, if you're choosing, should I put my money in the LEAF program or 1 trillion trees, or should I put it into saving an old growth forest? You're save the old growth forest. That's where the big carbon stocks are.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of local knowledge, someone wants to know if you'd recommend any published ecological scientific research done in collaboration with Indigenous folks beyond Robert Wall Kimmerer, who's great and has been quoted throughout the chat.
Yeah, I mean, Robin's work is phenomenal, and her book is so, you know, it's become so popular, which is really great. She has those basic principles of Indigenous knowledge systems in, you know, really embodied in her own life in her book. There are lots of good Indigenous authors in Canada, for example. You know, we're as a nation celebrating Indigenous authors right now, and their books are getting read and they're the most popular books out there. So for example, here's one that I've got here on my desk. It's called Life in the City of Dirty Water. It's written by an Indigenous, a Cree man. He grew up in Winnipeg, and he talks about what it's like to grow up Indigenous. And he's actually the lead environmentalist for 350.org in Canada. So he works with Bill McKibben. So the Indigenous people are writing. Here's another one, Richard Wangamis, What Comes from Spirit. There's a ton of authors. Here's another, I've got lots of them on my desk right now. In Canada, 21 Things You Don't Know About the Indian Act, which is about oppression, legal oppression of Indigenous people. So there's lots of resources out there. And there's going to be more and more and more. And I would say, get your hands on whatever you can and learn from them.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop because the questions aren't stopping. So yeah, this has been incredible. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I love the questions. They're great. And thank you everybody for hanging in there over this long talk.
Thanks so much for your time, Suzanne. We really appreciate you making the time for our little mushroom club. And I'm glad so many people were able to join in on this.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me.
All right, good night, everybody. I should also mention, actually, we have a YouTube channel for MAW. It's youtube.com/MAWDC, and we'll have the videos from tonight up on there. Great. Bye, everybody. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.